When most of us think about inflation, food comes to mind. Global food prices have soared to multi-decade highs, driven not just by the pandemic supply chain problems, but also rising fertilizer costs, global droughts, and of course the war in Ukraine. That has meant inflation here at home that is hard to dodge. Even as overall inflation started to plateau in Canada, inflation for food remains above 9%. Sylvain Charlesbois is Senior Director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. Sylvain, great to have you with us.
Well, nice to see you again, Amanda.
So one of the things, of course, we want to ask about the food inflation is whether, I hate to use the word transitory, it was the one economists and central bankers wanted us to use for inflation. It's sticking around long enough that it's become a point of pain. Is there light at the end of the tunnel when we see food prices? Is there some hope of them coming down in the future?
Sort of, although U.S. data this morning got us worried again. The food inflation rate is north of 13% retail, north of 8% in food service. Those numbers are a tad high. We were expecting numbers to drop in August, but in Canada, actually, numbers are lower. They've been lower compared to the U.S. over the last 2-3 months. So we're hoping that August will be really when we see the food inflation rate drop in Canada for the first time.
One of the things, of course, that we have seen is supply chain issues, that war in Ukraine that really did disrupt kind of global food chains. Will we see any kind of permanent shift or rethinking about where we source our food, what kind of food we'll get, and whether we could do it more directly, more locally, and whether that'll even be cheaper?
Yeah, there's a lot of thinking going on across the supply chain. In fact, the JIT model, the just-in-time model, is being question. As you know, Amanda, a lot of food companies have actually relied on the JIT model to do business over the last few decades. As we benefited from a more globalized food supply chain, we relied heavily on the JIT model, but now we're looking more at inventory capacity to support a just-in-case model split with the JIT model as well. So you can see that right now there's a lot of question going on. I had the pleasure to meet with the task force, the federal task force on supply chains. I suspect that they'll be delivering a report to the government in a few weeks. So let's see what's going to be in that report. But I do believe that there'll be some questioning around how we source our food globally.
We know that there are a few big players that dominate the food, certainly the food for grocery chains here in Canada. Yep. Is that good or bad? Do they bring our prices down because they've got purchasing power, or is there some competitive issue there that keeps prices higher than they would be?
Amanda, there's always some competitive issues, and of course, if you ask Canadians, most Canadians believe that inflation is playing a role in inflated prices that we see at the grocery store. We have looked at numbers the last 5 years, and ratios have been actually quite consistent, 2 to 4% ratios related to profitability, gross margins. All of them are pretty consistent. We look at the U.S. as well, same result. However, I must say, Amanda, results are a tad higher in 2022. So last 5 years, since the end of 2021, numbers have been consistent. But this year, grocers are doing very, very well. And I suspect that they're just trying to beat the market. When the inflation rate is at 10% and you have 18,000 different products in your store, you have to beat the market in order to support your margins or protect your margins as much as possible.
Sylvain, always good to have you with us. Appreciate your time.
Take care.
Sylvain Charlesbois is Senior Director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. Well, most Canadians have seen their real incomes fall for a couple of years as higher inflation means the cost of living has outstripped any wage gains they did have. Tight labor markets mean that now may be the time for bargaining for higher take-home pay. But is there a danger that we lock in inflationary pressures when we do so? Mark Hancock is National President of CUPE. Mark, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure, Amanda. Good to see you.
So we are seeing increases in wages. I mean, the most recent period, more than 5% in the hourly wage, which is significant, except, of course, it's not keeping pace with current levels of inflation. Paint the picture of how you think those things can match up.
Well, I mean, there's a couple solutions. This isn't the first time we've ever experienced high inflation. We had it in the late 80s, early 90s, and back then it wasn't uncommon to see wage increases of 5, 6, and even 7%. The other thing that we did back in those days, those earlier days, was we negotiated either shorter-term collective agreements, or we put in what we call COLA clause, which allow for cost of living allowances. So there's a number of tools that are available to both unions and employers when it comes to dealing with high cost of inflation.
So this is something, and we note that it happens in the private sector all the time, which is that people's wages, their increases are fixed, and then they kind of roll the dice on what inflation is that year. And sometimes it works in their favor, and sometimes it doesn't. And I guess we chose stability over cost of living guarantee. Should we go back to that less stable environment, but where you say, look, if inflation was higher than we thought, you're actually going to get pay that doesn't mean your pay was reduced this year?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the jury's out on how long this is going to last. I mean, it's been almost, 30 years since we've seen inflation like this. So is this a short-term bump where there's going to be 1 or 2 years of high inflation, 8, 7, 8, 9% sort of thing? Or is it going to be around for many years to come? So one of the solutions, as I said earlier, is negotiating shorter collective agreements so that you can make those adjustments sooner rather than later. You're not stuck in a long contract where you lose a lot of wages, or employers aren't happy that they're paying the wages that they're paying, which is another issue. Of
course, the flip side of that is we've seen great success read into long collective agreements. I remember the agreement made between Air Canada and its pilots, and everybody celebrated that it was a decade-long agreement. Obviously, from a bargaining position, it kind of ties your hands. But from a company's point of view, it means stability and certainty. How do we trade those things off?
Well, I'm going to be on the side of workers here, and yeah, it does buy peace, labor peace for a period of time. But, on both sides of the equation, I've never been a fan of long collective agreements. There's issues that come up during a term of a contract, not just money issues or benefit issues, but there's language that either side may want to make improvements on or try to change your work, like such as things like working from home now. There's a whole variety of other things that come up, and a 10-year collective agreement, in my mind, is far too long, even if you put in some safeguards around COLAs or wage reopeners. So I think it's much better to be negotiating 3 or 4 year collective agreements. But right now, I'd be looking at 2-year collective agreements, to be quite honest.
Not a ton of time here, Mark, but we keep hearing that the labor market is incredibly tight. We know there are unfilled jobs. Would we expect naturally for wages to go up? We know there's a gap between expectations and what's being offered. Should that be closed just by the way the market is shaped?
Well, I mean, you look everywhere right now. There's help wanted signs. I fly a lot just by virtue of being a national president, and it's a big country. And I'm starting to see some relief at airports. Of course, we represent flight attendants. There's been a lot of delays because of not enough staff working at airports. But that's true throughout the whole economy, throughout the whole public sector. So hopefully employers will recognize this and understand what it's going to take to get people back into those jobs, which is a decent wage.
Mark, so good to have you with us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Amanda.
Mark Hancock is national president of CUPE. Coming up, worried about your finances in the face of high inflation and sagging markets? We'll get some advice. But first, this. In case you've been lying awake nights worrying about the cost of shipping goods globally, we have good news. Freight rates for container ships have collapsed from their post-pandemic peaks. And in some cases, they're right back to where they were pre-crisis. Since container cost was one of the first signs of inflationary forces, the hope is that one day this ship will come in a whole lot cheaper. We're back after this.